Pesach is the time that celebrates the love in the relationship between Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We remember that HaKadosh Baruch Hu freed us and emancipated our ancestors from Mitzrayim, and we celebrate the fact that in the future HaKadosh Baruch Hu is destined to redeem us once again. But the avoda that we have before Pesach is to get rid of all of the Chametz which is in our possession. The Torah tells us that we are commanded not to own any Chametz on Pesach. And we are therefore instructed before Pesach to eradicate all forms of Chametz that we may own. And although we think intuitively that this is an avoda of cleaning and searching, the truth is that on a biblical daraisa level, the Gemara points out that all a person has to do to ensure that they don't own Chametz is bitul ba'alma, which means simply nullifying one's Chametz. And that's an important halacha. With all the cleaning and all the searching that we're doing, the most crucial, essential thing that we will do is simply saying that all chametz that may be in my possession is nullified like the dust of the earth. And the Gemara tells us that by declaring that point, there is no way that a person can transgress the isser of owning chametz on Pesach. Everything else that we do is all rabbinically mandated, so that we don't come to possibly eat the chametz, or possibly other reasons. But the essential law midaraisa is that we simply have to nullify our chametz. I would like to explore what exactly is the nullification of chametz. What are we doing? And moreover, what is the meaning that is infused in the bitul of chametz? So I'd like to take a step back and look at a Gemara in Psachim Davav Amud Beis, where the Amora Rav Elazar points out that there's a deep paradox in the Isser and the transgression of owning Chametz. On the one hand, a person only violates the Isser if the Chametz that is inside of their home belongs to them. It has to belong to you. If there is Chametz that does not belong to you inside of your house, then you don't transgress the Isser. There's no problem whatsoever. And we're quite familiar with that law. We sell our Chametz to non-Jews and we keep it in our homes. And there's no issue with that. As long as it doesn't belong to you, then the Torah says there's no issue with the fact that it's in your possession. However, Chametz on Pesach is something which is forbidden in benefit. The halacha is that if I don't get rid of my Chametz and I keep it in my house, it becomes forbidden to benefit from it. And the concept that we have in halacha is that a person cannot own something that is forbidden in benefit. It's a very deep idea. But something that I can have no tangible benefit from whatsoever cannot be owned. It resists ownership. Because ownership from a halachic perspective means that I have a control over it, that there's something I can do with it, that there's a shlita halachically that I can make something happen with this. I can sell it, I can benefit, I can eat it, whatever exactly it is. But if I have nothing from a specific item, if there's no possible way I can benefit from it, then it defies the sense of ownership from a human being. So for example, if I have Chametz on Pesach and I try to make a sale, it's not going to go through. It won't be binding. Because Chametz on Pesach is not my own. It doesn't belong to me. Because if it's forbidden in benefit, then it's not mine. And if it's not mine, then I cannot make a transaction with it. And Rav Elazar, the Amora, points out that there's the paradox. On the one hand, the only way to transgress the Isser of owning Chametz is if it belongs to me. If somebody else's Chametz is in my house, then it's not a problem. On the other hand, if I don't get rid of my Chametz and I keep it in my house, it becomes forbidden in benefit, and then I also cannot own it. So how does one ever transgress the prohibition of owning Chametz? It's a catch-22, so to speak. If I don't do anything and I keep it in my possession, it becomes asr b'hana. If it becomes asr b'hana, it defies my ownership. If it defies my ownership, then it's not mine. If it's not mine, then how am I ever transgressing the Isser? And that's a deep problem. It seems that the Isser is defeating itself. By the Torah saying I shouldn't own Chametz and restricting all sense of bitus on it, well then it becomes something which I cannot own. If I cannot own it, then how do I ever transgress the Isser? So Rav Elazar tells us as follows. There are two things where logically a person should not own them. But the Torah treats it as if it is still belonging to you. The Elohein, and these are two examples where we find this in the Torah. A bar b'reshus harabim. a pit that a person digs in the street. If I go to the street and I take my shovel and I dig in the street itself, do I own the pit? Did I become the owner of that real estate? No, it's still in the street. It's public property. It does not belong to me. But the Torah still says that I am the Baal Habor. And the Torah says, Baal Habor Yishalem, that the one who owns the pit, the owner of that piece of real estate, is liable if any damages are incurred inside of the pit. So how does that pit become mine? I don't own that piece of land. Because I dug there, the Torah says, Ason akosav ke'ilu ein b'rshuso, that by the digging of the pit itself, it somehow becomes as if it is now belonging to me. And the second example that Rav Elazar gives is Chametz misheisho sulamala, that as soon as Erev Pesach in the afternoon comes, we see the same phenomenon. Logically, I cannot own that Chametz. The Chametz cannot be owned. It's forbidden in Hana, and something that I can have no tangible benefit from. So in all senses of ownership, it defies it. I cannot own something that I have no benefit from. And yet the Torah says, Ason ki'ilu ein b'rshuso. Halachically, it is treated as if I am the owner of that chametz. So the answer to the question is simply, it's a scriptural decree. The facts are that the Torah is considering the chametz as if it is mine, when in reality, I cannot be the owner of it. The evil that is inside of my home, that chametz, is mine, even though in the normal logical sense of ownership, it should not be considered to be mine. Let's begin with that concept. And it always struck me as such a fascinating point that we find two examples in the Torah of things which logically should not be considered yours, and yet we have this scriptural decree that they are considered yours. We have the owner of a pit. When he digs in the street, he somehow now assumes a role of an owner towards the pit. He's responsible because the real estate becomes like his. And we have someone who owns Chametz on Pesach, where again, it shouldn't logically be considered owned, and yet the Torah considers it as if it is really owned by the person. What is the connection between the person who digs the pit in the street and the person who owns Chametz on Pesach? What in the world does one have to do with the other? And how do these two ideas stand as illustrations of something which are owned in the Torah, even though logically they should not be considered owned? So we know from the Gemara tells us that the Chametz on Pesach is representative of the Yetzer Hara. It represents the evil inclination. And we know that the evil inclination, the reason it's such a hard and deep enemy is because it exists inside of us before we have a chance to fight it. We are born with an innate sense of evil. The Sa'ar Shebe'isa, the leaven in the dough, which is represented by the Chametz, it is found inside of our core essence of who we are before we even know how to choose between good and bad. It's simply a part of us. On the other hand, there's a different type of evil in the world. There's the evil of digging a pit, of somebody taking a decision, taking a shovel, going to the street, digging a pit, endangering and harming other human beings, where we clearly see that it's the action of the person. It's external to their core. It's not them themselves, but what happens is they go do an action, they go dig in the street, and then suddenly there's a pit that's there because of them. So Chametz represents one type of evil, an innate sense of evil, a nature inside of a human being which is not perfect. And the idea of the Baal Habar is that there's an action that a person can do. There's some action that I can do that can cause harm to another human being, where the Torah says you own that action. That when I dig in the street, it's not simply I'm responsible because I hurt somebody, but that I become the owner of the pit itself. These stand to us as the two types of evil. Evil which exists inside of us. One which is natural, one which is innate, one which we are born with, and one which we create. Those are the two senses of evil. And the truth is that all of evil in the world doesn't really belong to us. It's not what we want. It's not what we would naturally want to do. It's not the true inside of our core in the way that we want to live our life. But it exists. The ason akosav ke'ilu ein b'reshuso. And the Torah tells us that even though we might not be happy or pleased with this evil inside of us, but the Torah treats it like we're the owner. We're responsible for it and we possess it. If I don't get rid of the chametz, despite the fact that it's asur b'hana, it's mine. And if I dig a pit, I can't walk away and say that the piece of real estate is not my problem. You are the owner of the real estate if you dig the pit. Your actions are a sense of ownership, and your nature you have a sense of ownership over as well. These are two examples which the Torah tells us of the way that evil exists with us and the way that we have the avoda of trying to make sure that we take the right, assume the right responsibility for dealing with the evil inside of us. Herein lies the great way that we can understand bitul. What is bitul? So we'll start with the opinion of Tosfos. Tosfos tells us that bitul is an act of hefker, that I am declaring the chametz to be ownerless. I own the chametz, I would transgress the isser. But if I mafker it, if I declare it ownerless, well then I'm relinquishing my ownership. It doesn't belong to me anymore. So if it doesn't belong to me anymore, then technically I'm not going to transgress the isser. That is Tosfos' view on what bitul means. However, many Rishonim note that the language of the bitul already doesn't sound like Tosfos. According to Tosfos, if a person is making bitul, then simply they should say, this is ownerless. But if you take a look at the language that we say, we start describing our chametz as being meaningless, as being like dirt, as having no value. Why does that have anything to do with whether it's ownerless? Let me just simply say, I'm not the owner of this. This is for somebody else, but I don't want this. So the Rishonim, Rashi, and the Ran, they understand different. Bitul is not an act of relinquishing ownership. I am not being mafker it. What I am doing, in the words of Rashi, I am fulfilling the directive of the Torah. The word that the Torah uses is tashbisu. Tashbisu is a very unique word. It's hard to find it in another place in the Torah. But it's not necessarily the same as tavaru. Tavaru means to destroy. Tashbisu means something a little bit looser. To lose your connection towards it. To not view it as something which is important. And as Rashi famously says, hashbasa balevi, that the connotation of the word hashbasa is something that's internal. It's a mentality. It's the way that I relate to something. So it still is mine and it's still in my possession. But if the way that I relate to it is not of having substance and value, if in my mind my attitude is that this is not important, then the Torah says that I'm not going to transgress the Isser. Tashbisu sa'ar mibatechem. If you no longer look at the chametz as having value, then you won't transgress the Isser. But the question is why? How do we understand that? After all is said and done, I still own it. And if the Torah is saying that if I own chametz, even though it doesn't seem logically I could ever be the owner, but the Torah is sticking it into my ownership if I didn't get rid of it, then who cares if I don't ascribe value to it? How are we answering the question? After all is said and done, did you get rid of the chametz? No. You still have it in your possession. Does it belong to you? Yes, it's still you're the title owner. Well then why are you not transgressing the Isser? So the Ran explains as follows, and it seems to be somewhat of an explanation within the opinion of Rashi. The idea is that remember, really you should never own chametz. Ason akasuv ki'ilu hein berushuso. The Torah is forcing us to be considered the owner if we don't get rid of it. As long as I express in verbal language that this is not something that I look at as having value, then the Torah does not force me to be the owner of that. It's as if I'm falling back on the idea that really you can never own chametz. It's a forbidden bahana, you can never own it. The only idea is that the Torah forces it into your possession, and the Torah does not force it into the possession of the person who does not see it as having any value. That's the understanding of bitul. By me seeing that this object is meaningless, that this is not something that I want, even if I didn't get rid of it, and even though still seems to be that I'm the owner, but if it's not something that I want, I don't see it as having value, the Torah does not forcibly stick it into my possession. So after all is said and done, what is the answer? How does nullification work? Nullification works because of the idea that I really am never the owner of chametz, and it's just that the Torah is forcibly sticking it back into my possession. The Torah does not perform that action of putting it by me unless it's something that I have value to. If I ascribe value to the chametz, it's as if I'm the owner. But if I don't, then the Torah does not stick it back in my possession, and I'm not, therefore, the owner of the chametz. And this is such an important idea when we think about the understanding of evil, that there's a natural evil inside of us, that the chametz represents the evil that we're born with, the part that's in our nature, in our core, the thing that we look at in the mirror and we wonder, am I a good person? That hard question. And the answer is, of course, the evil is there, but it's all the way that we relate to the evil, the way that we connect to the evil, the way that we ascribe value to it. And if we see it as a priority, if we look at the chametz inside of us as something significant, then the Torah forces us to be seen as the owner. There's no excuse for the fact that we're born with it. If we see it as having value, then that's who we are. That's defining our essence. But if I make a bitul, meaning I'm struggling with it, I recognize that it's there, but I'm not proud of it, I'd rather it wasn't there, I don't see it as having something of value, well then it's not that way. Then the Torah doesn't say that you're the owner. It might be inside of us. And the nature might be there, and the inclination and all the problems that we have might still be inside. The chametz is still in the pantry. But if we don't see it as having value, if that's not what we want to be, then the Torah doesn't say that we're the owner. And if we're not the owner, then we don't transgress the problem. That's a very deep point. That sometimes eradicating evil from inside of us doesn't mean getting rid of the chametz. It doesn't mean that I burned it, but it means that I'm not connected to it. It means that it's not really what it is that I desire. And herein lies the secret of bitul, and why bitul is so much of the most powerful thing that we're going to do. You can search for chametz, you can try to burn every little last crumb, but after all is said and done, the most important thing that you can do is the bitul. Because the bitul is defining who I am. And it looks inside of myself and it says every problem that I have and everything inside of me naturally and everything in my Yetzer Hara, that's not where the chashivas of my life is. That's not the way I ascribe value to it. It's an amazing thing. We know from Economics 101 that the price of something is defined by supply and demand. That's the way it works. The demand that it is, that's what gives it its value. And if the world doesn't have the demand, well, then it's not going to have value. And that concept is so true in Jewish thought as well. The word in Hebrew for chashuv, for something being significant, is the same exact word as a machshava, ches shin vez, because the way that we think about something is the way that we define its value. And if we prioritize something, then suddenly it's chashuv. But if I don't see of it something of value, then it doesn't have chashivas, then it's insignificant. And that's precisely what it is that we're doing when we're mevatel the chametz. Chametz removes value from it, the bitul removes value from the chametz inside of us. It says that that's not who I am. And even if it's there, but I don't own it, it's not there. It's as if it's there, but if I make the bitul, then it's not forced to be seen as if I am the owner. There's a very famous vart. It said from the Belzer Rav, when we get to the rasha, by the Maggid section, and the rasha is asking, Ma avoida hazois lachem. That question of Ma avoida hazois lachem is a penetrating question that forces each one of us to answer. What am I doing? The rasha inside of us challenges us. He says, what are you doing? Are you faking the motions of the Seder? Are you really connected to it? Is there not a part of you that's so tired that wants to move on? Is there not a part of you that doesn't know if you really believe in all of this? Is there not a part of you that sees that the entire avoda is irrelevant to my life? There's a part of truth to that question. Ma avoda hazois lachem. What are you doing? At some point in the Seder, that question will be asked by each one of us, if we're honest about it. But the answer that the Baal HaGoda says, he says, Af ata, even you. And that's already the first part of the answer, that the question is inside of yourself as well. Af ata, hakei shinav, you are to knock out his teeth. And that's obviously a very difficult response. What is the response? You knock out his teeth. So the Belzer Rav explained that if you take a look at the word rasha, Reish, Shin, Ayin, you'll see that on the outside, on the periphery, there's a Reish on one side and there's an Ayin on the other side. And that spells Ra. It's evil. And it seems that if I look at the periphery and I look at what a person is on an external sense, all there is evil. And the question of Ma avoda hazois lachem is the real definition of who he is. But if I'm haki yashinov, if I can look on the inside, I can extract the shin. And the shin, which has a core base on the bottom, and then 3 legs going up that represents the Jewish person, how he's connected to his avos, to Avram, Yitzchok, and Yaakov, that there's a strong base and 3 legs. Each one of us descend from a core. We have Avram, Yitzchok, and Yaakov. And even when it seems that on the periphery there's only a resh and an ayin and there's only ra, but on the inside we have a shin. But it has to be hakei shinav. We have to extract it. Sometimes it's not so easily discernible. It doesn't come to the surface. It has to be hakei shinav. It has to be extracted. And that idea of afata, to find ourselves in that avodah, to understand that the question of ma avodah zos lachem, that's a human being asking that question. And that human being is ourselves, afata. But that we have a response, that there's a shin inside of us. And that although we're struggling, and although we may be forced to see different components of ourselves and to honestly look in the mirror and sometimes to see evil, but that I can make a bitul to that evil. That I can say that that's not really what I'm owning. That's a part of me that I struggle with and that sometimes I fall to. But that's not my ownership. That's not what defines me. And even when sometimes I only see the resh and the ayin, the truth is that there's a shin. And even though it might seem dormant, but I can extract it. And that's the avodah of Pesach. To feel the beauty at the Seder requires that on Erev Pesach we make a bitul. We define who we are. And not everything that has to be with the Chametz is to destroy. Sometimes I can't find everything. Sometimes it's too hard to burn it. Sometimes I can't get rid of everything that's inside. But that we're all capable of bitul. Bitul is definitely something which can define us. It's a mental exercise. That the value of the way that we see our priorities, the value in the way that we see significance, so that determines the significance itself. That's exactly where it is. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give us the koyach to believe in the power of bitul. To believe that if I look in the Chametz and I don't see value, then it doesn't have the value. And if it doesn't have the value, then I cannot be the owner of it. And Mitzvah Hashem, this message should carry over into the Seder. And when the question of ma avodah zos lachem, when that insidious enemy asks us that question, and we wonder what it is that we're doing, we'll be able to be hakei shinav. Each individual afata will be able to see the shin, to express the shin, to bring it to the surface, and we should be zoiche to a beautiful Chag kosher v'sameach lanu u'lechol Yisrael.
Hi, this is Peretz Baruch Eichler, a proud alumnus of Ohr Somayach. Now what you just watched is one of the many programs that Ohr Somayach provides, leaving its impact on hundreds of thousands with so many more waiting to be reached. Ohr Somayach's Central Campus in Jerusalem has over 300 students presently learning there. And now you can be a vital part of spreading that bounty of knowledge worldwide by logging on to donate.ohr.edu. We can step up to the plate at this pivotal moment of Ohr Somayach's growth and bring the next generation of Jews home.